Hello students, I welcome you all to the fourth lecture of week 1 titled Visual Narratives in Print. The fourth lecture will be focused on Will Eisner's seminal book Comics and Sequential Art as well as Scott McCloud's book on Understanding Comics, the Invisible Art. In today's lecture, I will be discussing how these two theorists try to give an outline of how comics should be drawn. They gave out the technicalities of writing a comics, including what are the gutter spaces, what are the panels, what are speech balloons, how the text should be written, how the visual should be illustrated, how the story should be mapped. All these are constituted and follow a very detailed understanding in the book of Scott McCloud as well as Will Eisner. Though Scott McCloud borrows the idea of writing comics from Will Eisner, who is considered to be the father of comics. Now, I begin with the introduction to comics. Comics as an art form or medium is a vessel which can hold any number of ideas and images. The beginning of comics could be dated to ancient and medieval forms of art practices such as the Mexican Code, Tapestry, and Egyptian paintings, where images serialized or clubbed together conveyed a sense of story or narrative to the viewer. So as a result, comics as a book form, the question is, when did it come into existence? It was not since the beginning of time that narratives were written in the print form. But earlier, the messages were illustrated or messages were communicated on the rocks, as you would have seen. The symbols, signs were drawn on the earth, on walls, on caves, on ground. So as to give the reader an idea about what kind of visuality was prevalent in the olden times. So comic as a book form, comic as printed, packed book came into existence very later, but prior to this, it doesn't mean visual narratives did not exist, but visual narratives existed in a much more diverse and different manner than in a very compartmentalized, very formal packaged form as we see it in the form of comics. A collage or collection of paintings or photographs to suggest a narrative can also be summed up as the early beginning of comics. Just as it is written, so many pictures, when they are clubbed together in the form of photograph, in the form of paintings. For example, when you are seeing a photo album of a child and it traces the growth of a child from their small age to their elderly age, to trying to give the viewers, trying to give the audience an impact, how the child is growing up, maybe the first day, documenting the first day of the school, then documenting the first day of the college, documenting the freshers party, farewell party, then the job, receiving the first job. All these things, when they are projected in a photo album in a very linear form, that also forms a narrative. So though it may not be in the comic book form, but still the print pictures which are there in front of you are also giving you a narrativized form, a linear form, which was different from the packaged formal comic book form. Rodolphe Toffer is considered to be the father of modern comics. Just as I said earlier that Will Eisner is considered to be the father of graphic novel, Rodolphe Toffer is considered to be the father of modern comics, whose light satiric picture stories that started in the mid-1800s employed cartooning and panel borders featuring the first independent combination of words and pictures in Europe. So the first modern comics included the panel borders. These were the technicalities that were employed in the modern comic. At least there were kind of boxes. So what are panels, what are speech boxes, that we'll gradually get to know in the subsequent slides of this presentation. So now what you see on your screen is an Egyptian scroll, a painting, a photo, a visual of an Egyptian scroll. Then we have another second picture of BU tapestry, which I referred, and then the third one is Mexican code painting. So these are three different kind of paintings which kind of give you an idea about how comics as a form started, how comics medium began. Egyptian scroll, as you see, it is in a form of narrative. So there is a linearity, there is a kind of story which is being told from the first picture to second picture to third picture, and as it moves in that direction, it is trying to give its viewers the story without the text, without the literary words that tend to follow in a formal comic book format. In the second picture that you see, that is of BU tapestry, which is from the Norman conquest, from the war, you see that so many people. So this is a picture which is in vacuum, and if the picture is in vacuum, you would definitely not be able to identify the context. So this is a picture which refers to say that this picture can stand as an isolated image, but this picture cannot be brought into a narrative form. This can be read and interpreted as people traveling on the ship in the sea. The sea can be, and all sorts of imagination can come into account when you are taking into consideration visual or any image. You can have any number of ideas that these are the people who are traveling to some place, or these can be the explorers, or the ship was wrecked due to the violent storm. There are so many ideas that come into our mind when we see an isolated image. So the isolated image is very different from the narrative comic book format. But when we see the third image also, Mexican code painting, here also we see Mexican code painting. Why I am referring to the Mexican code? Because it is kind of indigenous art that is being displayed through this painting, and this painting also have some sort of narrative, some sort of storyline in it with so many panels. You see, the first panel is a broad rectangular format, then you have in the second row you have small squares which are trying to communicate a story. Then you have the third rectangle, huge vast rectangle, and then in the fourth row again you have squares which are trying to give you an idea about how the comic form emerged with the emergence of, with the techniques of panels, with the technique of layout, which was all being displayed in a paper form, giving the comics medium a print form of reality. Now, background to sequential art. Now, sequential art, as the word itself suggests, that a art which has a sequence, which has something prior to it, which also has something next to it, something after it. So it follows a sequence. It is a story which, as I said in my earlier lectures from week 1, that it has to have a proper beginning, middle and end, and so does comics also has to have a proper beginning, middle and end, in a way that it is easily comprehensible, it is easily understood by the receivers who are reading it or viewing it for their art's sake. The daily newspaper strip and the comic book can be seen as example of sequential art. So what can be, in the very basic terms, even a basic newspaper strip can also be a sequential art format, can also be referred as the very minuscule comics book, that newspaper strip. The vocabulary of sequential art has garnered popular attention, especially amongst the young generation. Comics, as an interplay between words and images, require the reader to exercise both visual and verbal interpretive skill. So, as a medium, comics as a form has to have literary text that accompanies the visual. So, but it does not mean in any way that the visual overtakes or the literary word overtakes, but they both have to be in some balance with each other, that they kind of act as supplementary material, they kind of complement each other rather than each weighing heavily on the other. The regiments of art, which means perspective, symmetry, brushstroke. How a visual is being drawn, that simply means a regiment of art. And the regiments of literature. Literature includes grammar, plot, syntax, word placing, vocabulary, and so many other things. They get synthesized upon each other. Reading the comic book calls for both aesthetic perception and intellectual pursuit. So a comic book reader does not has to very passively consume just the image, or a comic book reader does not have to be intellectual enough to understand the complex vocabulary which are drawn in the speech bubbles. But a comic book reader has to have the ability to be able to supplement the visuals with the verbal. That aesthetic perception, the aesthetic quality of the visual is being complemented, is being interpreted by the intellectual skills of the reader, that they both act with each other or that they both play with each other in a very balancing fashion. The grammar of sequential art. Comics utilize a sequence of repeated images and recognized symbols. The constant repetition and usage of familiar visuals and symbols to express similar ideas will create a language or a literary form of its own. This deliberate and systematic application is what forms the grammar of sequential art. The text reads as an image. Lettering, when seen as a graphical unit, can be seen as an extension of the imagery itself as long as it serves the narrative of the story. So another thing that needs to be kept in mind, that the words that are being used in the speech balloons or the speech bubbles, they need to have some sort of relation with the visual being depicted. The words cannot be independent, the words cannot be arbitrary, the words cannot in any way be not related to what is being displayed in the visual. On the contrary, it has to join the visual with the verbal. So the words that are there have to be in direct association, in direct relationship with what the artist or the illustrator wants to show in the comic book. So it should be an extension of the word, should be an extension of the visual rather than an explanation of the visual. One is trying to make a comic book, the writer, there are two people working at the same time, the artist or the illustrator and the writer. So the task of the writer should be to be an extension of what the artist wants to communicate, but not to give an inference or not to draw an explanation or not to give a meaning. It should not be a word meaning kind of play that the speech boxes are trying to communicate to the readers. So, and the next is text in concert with art can influence the reading process. When the both are placed next to each other as an extension of each other but not as an explanation of each other, then they both can enhance, then they can make any comic book as a very hit, as a very popular comic book. Now, we come to our first text, that is Will Eisner. Will Eisner's text, Understanding Comics. In this text, he has made several arguments which should be followed and which should be read by any of the budding or emerging comic book writer. Will Eisner tries to give you the layout, he tries to give you the chart, the map of what is the right way. Obviously, there is no right way, but at least, the guidelines that he lays out, the tools, the methodology that he gives to the budding comic book writers are very important, not only for the writers, but also for the readers, for their understanding that how they should be read, what is the right way, how they should be understood, how the meaning of the comic book can be enhanced when you're reading visuals and verbal on the same page. Visual storytelling is more than just making visually appealing photos. It's also about using visuals to tell a story. Comics are powerful because they use a combination of words and imagery to portray complicated concepts, feelings, and behaviors. Now, for example, because comic books is in a print format, if I try to bring something which is very visual these days, that is, for example, Instagram stories or maybe Instagram posts, These posts are kind of Instagram, this social media app of Instagram, it was kind of meant to put photos, only photos, because obviously there is no other use of this app apart from putting photos of almost everything that you are doing in your day-to-day life. But now we see that the photos are being accompanied by the posts, or by the long subtitles, by the long lengthy explanations that these photos are giving. So what you are trying to do, you are putting a photo, and at the same time you are also giving out a lengthy write up about that photo, that why you are giving up the context, why, how, in what circumstances, when, and what will this photo do, in order to trying to create, in order to trying to give the meaning to that photo. So almost similar thing happens in the comic books. When you are reading a photo, or when you are reading a comics, when you are reading a comics and watching a photo, so they are not just a collection of photos, but photos which are trying to tell a story, a photo which have a narrative form, a photo which have a story. So the visuals have a story of their own, which are very different from the literary novels or words. Comics are powerful because they use a combination of words and imagery to portray complicated concepts, feelings and behaviors. So the task of a comic book writer becomes all the more complex, because he is not just writing about outward reality, but so many psychological factors that go on to affect the comic book characters. For example, if a Superman is thinking something, so the comic book writer has to bring out something that is there in the Superman's mind for the readers to understand what he's thinking. So in a way, they are also trying to materialize, to visualize, to give a concrete form even to the abstract ideas, so which could not be properly explained if they were not accompanying, or if they were not given the speech bubbles in that very form. Eisner highlights how language and imagery differ from one another and work in tandem in comics. In contrast to language, which offers dialogue, context, and clear information, photography captures mood, action, and minute nuances that words alone could overlook. These two elements must be balanced and interact. Just as I said earlier, when he says about photography, that means actually visuals, the images, the visual appeal that the image creates. Idea creation and conceptualization are the first steps in the comic book. So how to start a comic book? First of all, you should have some idea. What is this comic books going to be about? There should be something concrete. You should be very thorough about the idea that on which you are going to write a comic book. So idea creation and conceptualization are the first steps. The plot, characters and themes must all have a clear vision and purpose at this stage. You should be very clear in your thoughts who are going to be the characters, how I am going to write the story. I mean, the creative artist should be very clear in his mind how he is going to write the comic books. And when the writer explains the concept of the comic book, that this is the comic book that I intend to have, he communicates that very idea to the illustrator, on the basis of which the illustrator subsequently draws the design, subsequently draws the visuals, because the visuals are something which are produced secondary, but the write-up is the first thing that happens in production of comic books medium. Usually, the writer creates a script after establishing the idea. As a template, the script describes the main scenes, dialogue and narrative flow. So what are the very important characteristics of a good script? That it should be able to communicate what are the major scenes that my comic books is going to have, some dialogues and narrative flow. When should be the climax, when should be the tragedy happen, when there should be a humorous scene. All these things should be very clear right at the outset. It offers a framework on which the artist can construct the story's visual components. Obviously, after writing, after creating the idea, you are then giving the illustrator a chance to draw upon the visuals which could complement the words. Next He says the planning and sketching stage of the procedure begins, the planning and sketching begins subsequently. In order to successfully map out the visual narrative, a sequence of drawings representing the distinct panels must be made. Storyboards play a crucial role in improving the narrative's consistency and clarity. Thus, artist, writer and editor join hands for successful comic production. So, it is not just illustrator and the writer, but when the task is completed, when the draft of the comic books is prepared, it is the editor whose task is to decide which are the redundant pages, which are the obsolete pages, which are the most creative pages, and how they should be projected, whether the page should come in the front, what should be the cover page, what should be the back page, what should be the size of the book, what should be the form, whether it should be paperback or whether it should be hardbound. So all these things also play a very important role in the production of comics. The use of imagery and symbolism in comics to convey complex ideas and themes that can be difficult to express through language alone is one of its main features. A strategically placed image symbol can capture a whole idea or mood, giving readers a better comprehension of the story. Example, a chain can be used to show desire for freedom. So, a writer as well as the illustrator need to be in agreement with each other that how a particular event should be visualized. For example, if you want to show a woman who feels, who wants to be free, or who is feeling that she's tied, her life has changed after marriage, that she's tied to domesticity and there is no rescue to it. So the writer as well as the artist have to come together in order to decide that what should be the image that we should give, what should be the visuals that should complement such kind of mood, such kind of dejection and disappointment that this woman is going through. So, for example, chains. An image of chain, the symbol of chain, she tied to chain, or maybe chains in some form can be used to show her need for liberation, her need for freedom. So all these things have to be drawn in agreement with the writer and editor. So a writer themselves cannot impose upon the illustrator that this is something that nor an illustrator go on freely drawing whatever they think it to be fit. They both have to be in association with each other. The symbolic use of color and how it can be used to emphasize specific components in a panel or sequence or to evoke various moods are other topics examined by Eisner. So what should be the color? For instance, while blue may suggest serenity, melancholy or detachment, crimson may be used to symbolize danger, passion or violence. So, for example, red is the color of violence, red is the color of passion, red is the color of intensity, while blue is the color of peace, blue is the color of serenity, blue is the color for calm. So, what kind of mood you want to represent of a particular character? So, there can be a blue background, there can be a red background, there can be a black background where a tragedy has to be depicted, there can be, so the color choices also matter in trying to communicate the mood, the flow, the circumstances through which the character is going on, is facing in the comics. Instead of being merely extraneous components, dialogue which are contained in the speech balloons, captions and sound effects are essential to the narrative since they provide depth and improve the reader's experience. How these literary elements are used strategically can have a big impact on how a tale is interpreted and comprehended. So, speech balloons also play a very important role, and sometimes in order to activate the intensity of the ears, that what kind of voice was produced, what kind of noise, what kind of music is being produced, sometimes the speech balloons also contain those sounds in the form of whack, boom, in the sense of murmuring, shh. So these kind of sounds are also produced in the speech balloons, and they are equally important in trying to communicate, in trying to visualize the kind of impact that the sound has on the readers. The late 1930s through the early 1950s were known as Golden Age comics. For example, Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman form the part of Golden Age comics era. Now, Silver Age of comics begins from 1950 and remains lively till 1970, while the Bronze Age begins in 1970 and ends in 1980. But Silver Age and Bronze Age largely draw upon the subject matter that range from tackling societal problems such as drug misuse, racism and political corruption. So there is a very stark shift that you see from Superman, Batman comics, that is the comics of superheroes, to the comics situated in social reality in the Silver Age and Bronze Age. Probably the people were fed up of reading these fantastical comics and wanted comics also to highlight the social reality in which the people were living in. Now we come to the McCloud's arguments. McCloud says words can be utilized in a variety of ways to support, elaborate on, or reaffirm what the artwork already depicts. He demonstrates how words and images both lack something when used alone, but when used effectively, they may advance a narrative. He opens the chapter by displaying a wide variety of icons, explaining that they can represent language, science, communication, and other subjects. The author can use a variety of lines, colors, and icons to create realistic, unrealistic, or specific styles of drawing of people, places, feelings, and moods. He goes on to discuss various design ideas. Further, he also talks about abstraction and how when pictures are abstracted, they are focusing on certain details, which then allows the meaning of a cartoon to be amplified even more than the picture itself. So, most of the things, as I said it earlier, that McCloud's arguments, he draws from Will Eisner, but he goes further, a step further in highlighting the importance of abstract images in comics also. So, he says not everything, not all the images should be as clear when the reality itself is as complex, when the reality itself is difficult to understand, then how can somebody expect that images will communicate everything, that images will not have the abstraction which kind of imitates the reality. So in a way he says that when pictures are abstracted, they are focusing on certain details. So one can identify the meaning behind abstract images by focusing in what way these images are being, what is the background, or why has he chosen this kind of this design of panel, why it can be completely panel free image which covers the entire page, or it can be an image which is made in a very small panel trying to reduce the identity of a character to a very small level, and when the image becomes pervasive, it is drawn all through the page, then it shows larger than life character. So in a way how the picture is drawn, even the abstract image itself communicates some ideas which should be understood by reading the images in detail very deeply. He continues further, he discusses the comics gutter. So what are the gutter spaces, the technicalities? Gutter spaces are the spaces between two panels. For example, you have one panel where one image and speech bubble is drawn, and another gutter says there is another panel. So the space between two panels, in some of the comics, in some of the places you will see the space between two panels is very big, and in some places the space between two panels is very small. So this space, the gutter space, is also reflective of the passage of time. It tries to denote, because it takes reader time to jump to read from one panel to another panel. It also shows if the panels are drawn very far away, it shows that lot of time has passed away, and when the panels are drawn almost next to each other, it shows that the events are happening in continuity immediately one after the other. So the gutter gives the reader the opportunity to piece together their own perception of what transpires in between panels. Unlike a larger gutter, which is likely to be viewed as more time passing, a smaller gutter typically indicates less time. Moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, or scene to scene, and aspect to aspect are the categories into which all of these transitions fall. The reader can deduce that time is being separated from one moment to the next by using the panel as a symbol. Furthermore, the panel that is currently being read represents the present, and the panels that come before and following it represent the past and the future respectively. In conclusion, I would like to say, comics as an art form symbolizes a host of images and ideas. As an art form, it is the synthesis between the realm of painting and literature, closely following the grammatical model of both. So you say that, the comic book draws from literature as well as the painting. From painting, it draws the visual form, and from the speech balloon, speech text, it draws the literature, that what kind of language, what kind of pronunciation, what kind of vocabulary should be used. It is all taken from the literature. So it is bringing together, the comic book is bringing together two diverse fields, that is of two diverse disciplines. One is from the fine arts and the other is from the humanities. Comics at best represents a sequence of images that together communicate a combined narrative. The use of panels in comics serves as a special narrative tool that separates it from the art forms such as film. Somebody may ask you, how are comic books different? Comic books are different because you have too many panels, or forget about one or two panels, you have number of panels on one page. But this is not the case with films. In films, you can only watch one scene at a time, trying to give the viewer a sense of reality. But when a comic book is being read, a reader is always aware that they are reading a book form. Thank you.